Hey friends, it's time for our last video session before our class on Wednesday, February 3rd. And we're going to focus on the last three of the commandments tonight. And that is number 8, number 9, and number 10. And you may think, we've been through lots of commandments. We get the gist, love God, love your neighbor. And that's true. But I think these last commandments about bearing false witness and about coveting are perhaps the easiest for us to miss out or miss the mark on. And so I think this is a case where we've saved the best for last. And so let's hop in and grab your small catechisms and let's talk a little bit about the Eighth Commandment. This is personally my favorite of the commandments, and I actually reference it probably more than any other of the 10 commandments in my life as a pastor and as a human being. And when we read here, it'll explain why. The Eighth Commandment says, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." What does this mean? Luther says in the Small Catechism, "We are to fear and love God so that we do not tell lies about our neighbors, betray or slander them, or destroy their reputations. Instead, we are to come to their defense, speak well of them, and interpret everything they do in the best possible light." Interpret everything our neighbors do in the best possible light. Boy, if that isn't a hard commandment to keep. And I think this commandment about bearing false witness is about telling the truth. It's about being honest, and it's about helping maintain the reputation and what's happening in the lives of others that we don't know the full story about. Now, I know when I was in middle school, and I'm sure as you are too, that there are all sorts of times in every single day where there's temptation to maybe gossip or to tell little lies about someone or to make a story something more than it is. And I think that all those rumors that you think about or things that you think about people, it's not just young people or kids. This happens with adults all the time. We make judgments before we understand really what's happening. And especially when it comes to sin, we don't know what's going on in a heart or a mind or in the actions of another. Some people would say the 3 ways in which we bear false witness are lying deliberately about our neighbor. That's bearing false witness, not telling the truth. Also, by passing on something we hear about another person without knowing it for ourselves. And the third way we've talked about with violence and murder and other things and theft is by keeping silent and not being an ally when someone says something against a neighbor or a friend that we know to be false and not saying, "Whoa, I don't think that's true." And it's all too easy for us to think about the times in the past week when we maybe have borne false witness against our neighbor, where we've harmed someone and their reputation and their character, or if we've judged them for something that we don't know. This happens a lot about people we think are our enemies, political enemies. Maybe they're part of a different social group. There's all sorts of times, especially when that 8th commandment hits us and we feel convicted that we don't see or name or say to others what might be the best possible light or give it the best possible angle for something that's happened. My guess is that there's been times when perhaps someone has shared a rumor at school or among friends or others about you. Living out the 8th commandment would be a friend, saying, "Hey, I know that's not true about you." And then telling other people, "That's not the way I know you to be." And so it's trying to speak well of those people we know and even those we don't, who might be strangers to us. But it's not hopping on and joining in being mean or bullying or defacing someone. I used to do some work with an anti-bullying group, and one of the things that we talked about was how hard it can be to live out the 8th commandment especially if it means stepping out against someone who's being bullied, being an ally, a friend, stepping out in their favor. And I think that that's really true. And so the next time you feel tempted to judge someone, maybe even your parents, think about what might be the best possible light. What might be going on beneath the surface that we don't know about? What might interrupt our human nature that says, I want to judge really hard? I love what Martin Luther writes about judgment. We're good at it, right? But that work is the work of God, judgment about sin and other things. Luther says, knowledge of sin does not entail us or give us a right to judge it. We may see that our neighbor sins, but to make our neighbor the talk of the town is not our business. If we interfere and pass some sort of sentence or judgment on them, we fall into greater sin than the one we think we're calling out. Luther says, when we become aware of a sin, make your ears like a tomb and bury it. You might address it directly with a person if you see something happening that you think isn't right. But it's not making it everybody's business. I grew up in a small town. Somebody knew I broke my foot in middle school before I even had the x-rays back from the doctor. And that sort of gossip, that sort of circles of, hey, did you hear this about so-and-so? We have to think about what that is about ourselves. What are the things that cause us to want to put others down? Is it that we don't feel loved or trusted ourselves? What ways might sharing gossip or thinking about someone we don't like and sharing that news be impactful because of something that we're feeling? It's a question to think about in your small groups. And then we move to the last section of the commandments, the 9th and the 10th, and we're going to view them together as one unit for our purposes. And that is this, the 9th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. What does this mean? We are to fear and love God so that we do not try to trick our neighbors out of their inheritance or their property, or try to get their things for ourselves by claiming to have a legal right to it and the like. But instead, we are to be of help and service to our neighbor in keeping what is theirs. And the 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. What does this mean? We are to fear and love God so that we do not entice, force, or steal away from our neighbors, their spouses, household workers, or livestock, but instead urge them to stay and fulfill their responsibilities to our neighbors. Now, what is coveting? That's a fancy word we don't use in everyday talk. I think coveting here is wanting something that someone else has, and wanting it badly. Wanting it so much that we might create a plan in our heads to get it, to steal it, to weasel it away, to find a way to get it or to have an advantage. Coveting what belongs to another person might be about our desires, our wishes, our dreams, but it also disrupts community. Have you ever seen or heard of a story where two people want the same piece of property or the same thing? I've talked before about sharing the same number of pieces of pizza with my wife. And so one of the things that I want us to think about is, what is it that creates in our hearts and in our actions a desire to covet, to want? Having wants and desires is not a bad thing in and of itself. But what God is saying in the 10 Commandments and what Luther is explaining in the Catechism is that coveting, desiring it so much we're willing to kind of wrong somebody else to get it, leads to stealing. Coveting is an attitude that leads to actions that violate the other commandments, which is, I think, why it's the last two. Coveting not just our neighbor's house, but all of the things that belong to our neighbor. I love what it says, that whenever we covet, we automatically disrupt harmony, friendship, neighborhood, family, community, and even our own inner selves. And so I encourage you to take a minute and think about things that you have coveted. How far would you go? How desperate might you be to do something you might regret or that would pretty easily violate one of those other commandments? It really is disruptive to our notion of how we love and care for our neighbor. It's why Luther in the Catechism encourages us to think about what can we do to help our neighbors keep what is theirs, support what is theirs. Now, those all feel a little abstract, and so the easy thing to think about is a couple of real-life examples. My friend Joe tells a story about losing his wallet somewhere out on the street. Now, assuming I came up and found it, a covetousness would say, this isn't mine, but I found it. I'm going to take it to the police station. Maybe I'll just take a 20 for my time. Right? That's an attitude of coveting. The Catechism says I should be of help and service in letting the neighbor keep what is his. So if my friend Joe loses his wallet, I find it in the street, take it to the police station. I'm not taking a little finder's fee. I'm not making it about what did I get out of this? Didn't I do a good thing? That kind of misses the point of why you would do an act of love or service. And I think, what can I gain from this is a really important question for us to think about when we think about coveting. But those other things, too, are also about our interpersonal relationships. There's a story I heard about a couple of friends playing on the soccer team. And one of the players was really, really struggling. They were trying to pick up some new skills and introduce some new plays. And one of the friends was really having a hard time. And at practice one day, the other friend, who was a little bit more skilled at this particular piece, helped the friend who was struggling, even though they were vying for the same starting position. That would be an act of love of neighbor that would be contrary to coveting. It's not trying to help our own benefit and then help others, but it's putting the needs of another person first. It's an act of selflessness, and that comes to us, great examples from Jesus. And Jesus says that to love and serve a neighbor is to, in some ways, die to self. And sometimes I think the commandments are saying, who is most important? Is it yourself or the neighbor? It's both, right? But it can be an act of love to think of someone beside ourselves first and foremost. And so the last two commandments are really about not having that attitude of wishing we had something else. That grass is greener on the other side of the fence saying that sometimes you might hear. That what God and what Jesus have come to show us is that loving the neighbor, being content with what God has given us, helps us to not lean into those other 10 commandments. In fact, in the large catechism, Martin Luther says, "We weave all the commandments into a garland, the last into the first. And in them all you find these two things. You should fear and trust God. And if you trust God, you can't mistrust God, and you won't blaspheme or take the Lord's name in vain. You won't be disobedient to your parents. You won't kill or do anyone harm, but rather you'll help one another. And so too with all the rest of the commandments." And so these last commandments about coveting and about gossip and false witness and slander and lying are really, I think, just the whole center of what it means to love God and to love our neighbor. We're not going to do it perfectly. We're going to mess it up. That's the nature of sin. We're stuck in sin. We can't get out. And that God's grace helps us. But as we think about coveting and as we think about those other parts of how our tongues get us into trouble, it's often noticing our distrust of God, our trust in other things, thinking we can do it ourselves, that really is the root of what's happening. And so as we think about the 10 Commandments and their meaning, I hope you understand them less to be rules and more as guidelines that remind us of our human nature, how easy it is for us to put our trust in other stuff, and how much we need God's love and grace to make our relationships with God and with one another right again, with forgiveness and mercy, and grace. We'll talk a little bit more about these in our class time on Wednesday. We'll see you then.